presentation about learning styles and their role in education. Today, I will be presenting on the way that learning styles influence the academic performance of the participants that they are used with, and particularly on its effects on high school students, as I believe that there is a significant lack of research regarding the effects of learning styles on that particular group. Before I begin, I want to introduce myself. My name is Collin and I currently attend Dan River High School as a senior. I have been accepted into Averett University, and I intend to pursue further education through their aviation program to later become a pilot. While some may argue that there are more important fields of study than learning styles, I chose it as my research topic for multiple reasons. For instance, the experience I've had thus far with the educational system has made me desire a positive change for it, which I believe learning styles may be the key for. Also, learning styles can easily be applied to real-world situations like school and other learning processes, which gives them practicality and benefits to those that it's employed on. Additionally, in my personal experience, visual and auditory learning styles have been practiced in schools frequently, interchangeably, and this is why I chose to ignore other learning styles, such as kinesthetic, alongside the fact that using less learning styles made my research more specific and manageable. To determine learning styles' effects, it's important to first define exactly what they are. However, learning styles are still a misunderstood field in part due to the fact that research just has not been conducted on it. One definition states that the combined use of text, audio, graphics, or otherwise with the purpose to stimulate the learner is what learning styles are. The commonality between definitions by researchers is the mention of auditory or visual learning, and thus it can be determined that, at the very least, a learning style requires the use of either an auditory or visual method of learning. Furthermore, the purpose of learning styles, according to Krasinski, is for them to be analyzed so that the environment that they are used in can be optimized and understood for the improvement of academic performance. However, there is an underlying issue that has been outlined by Wilson. It is currently difficult to actually employ these learning styles, as for reasons mentioned previously, like the lack of unity in the field. Defining learning styles is incredibly important to my research, as when I am performing testing and experimenting with them, I need to know how they should best be used to avoid confusion and error. Because the main area of application for learning styles is an academic environment, it's incredibly important that the effects it has on the educational performance of students is recorded. For example, in one study, the way that words and phrases were remembered by participants depending on the learning style that they were tested with. This study found auditory memory to be weaker than visual memory. In another study, different auditory and visual tasks were used to determine the effectiveness of learning styles on academic performance. This article revealed that, when used together, the cognitive load of visual stimuli should be kept relatively low in relation to auditory stimuli during activities such as education, because too much can decrease proficiency in memory. These studies are all vital to my own research because they outline the ways and methods that research should be conducted regarding learning styles and how data should be obtained. Notably, learning styles seem to have a unique effect on groups that can be differentiated from the average group by underlying factors that inhibit them from learning at their best. For example, in one study, students with ADHD are found to struggle with visual learning but excel auditorily. Thus, it can be concluded that students with ADHD in real academic environments should be able to learn through an auditory style rather than a visual. Similarly, another study about dyslexia determined that students with dyslexia learn best when taught auditorily. One group that was tested had cochlear implants, which are small devices meant to provide hearing to those who do not possess it, which discovered that the learning style that improved their academic performance the most was the visual style, as opposed to the previously mentioned studies. The testing of specific groups is important to my research, as I am testing on specifically high schoolers. Because of the age range and perhaps other factors for these students, it could influence results to lean one way or the other. Now that I've discussed my findings and others' research, I'd like to discuss my own research. Specifically, I wanted to determine how learning styles had an influence on high school students. To me, personally, I found high school, and specifically junior and senior year, to be some of the most challenging work I've done for school. Learning styles, if they have an effect, could impact the difficulty of work in high school in a beneficial way. As someone who considers themselves a visual learner, I hypothesized that for this study, visual learners would score higher than the auditory learners if provided a test. I also thought this because notes, boards, and slideshows are commonplace in high school, so the students that use these so often would be familiar with them. The null hypothesis theorized that there would be no difference in score between the groups. I had many variables for this study. The independent variables were the learning styles, as I changed them for each trial. The dependent variable was the test scores for each group, as the learning styles changed the information provided from the test scores. The control group was given no learning style and was simply given a test with no information. A constant between the visual and auditory groups was the information provided and the test given. The only thing that was manipulated by me was the medium in which the information was given. As you can see, I obtained consent from all who were necessary. The students, specifically, were my participants, and a teacher acted as an assistant. The materials required for my experiment were notes, both in visual and auditory versions, tests to take after reading or listening to the notes, and pencils to take the test. I pulled participants from both Dan River and Chatham High School for my sample, 20 from Dan River and 10 from Chatham. All participants were conveniently sampled, but were randomly assigned to their groups, aside from Chatham, which served as the control group. The population I intended to draw information from was high schoolers as a whole. In order to conduct this experiment, I needed 2 sets of steps for 2 different groups. The standard format for testing was mostly the same, but the way the information needed for the test was changed. For both groups, I instructed them on instructions before either assigning notes or an audio track of those same notes, and then either assigned the test once the track stopped or once students were done reading. I took up physical notes so that they could not be used during testing. After both groups finished testing, raw data was compiled and statistical analysis, which I used a one-way ANOVA for, was conducted. The control group, while not mentioned in this slide, had only one step, aside from giving them instruction, compiling data, and conducting statistical analysis, which was simply assigning the test. All testing was done in a classroom setting with minimal distractions. These are the photos taken from my visual group, and you can see me in the first picture overseeing note reading, the second providing instruction, and in the third you can see the participants taking the test. In the background, you can see my assistant teacher, who let me borrow her room. My auditory group photos look much the same as my visual ones. In the first and final photo, I'm giving instructions and reading off of the sign-in sheet to do one last check that everyone I needed was present. In the middle photo, you can see 2 students taking the test. This is a photo from the control group of students working on tests that I handed out without notes to help them. Many of the students did not want to be photographed, hence why there are so few pictures compared to previous slides. The test that I used for my statistical analysis of my data was the one-way ANOVA, as my data had only one independent variable between trials, and I wanted to test for statistically significant differences between the trials, which the ANOVA does. However, as it turns out, when I performed the test at a significance level of 0.05, it was revealed to me that there was no statistically significant differences between trials, as the p-value was equal to 0.086. In this graph, all data that matters for the ANOVA is on display here. As a whole, this graph shows the mean test scores that each group achieved on their test. The y-axis represents the mean test scores that could have been achieved by the groups, and the x-axis displays what groups achieved what mean score. The mean score for the visual group was 38, while the auditory groups was 46, and the control score was 28. There is not sufficient evidence at the 0.05 significance level to conclude that there is any statistically significant differences between auditory and visual learning styles based on my sample taken from high schoolers. Alongside this conclusion, backed up by my data and the p-value I obtained from a one-way ANOVA test, there were no outliers or otherwise unusual data from the tests that I performed. Thus, I believe that the only conclusion I can draw from this research is that the auditory and visual learning styles had no significant differences. Because the null hypothesis of my research was accepted, the amount of implications to be drawn from the data are limited. One, however, that I can make is that in a classroom setting where students are learning, it might not matter what style they choose to teach with because both groups scored similarly on their tests. Unlike the previously mentioned literature that I've used to compose my literature review, my study did not include students that had learning disabilities or hearing issues, among other details. I believe this to be the main root cause for my rejection of my hypothesis, as all of the students within my sample were the same with no noteworthy differences between them. This is reflected best in my results in comparison to other research. While mine was not statistically significant and little to no conclusions can be drawn from it, Other studies with differences in their sample find data that can be interpreted in a significant way. For example, my p-value is more than 0.08, but these other studies contain p-values less than 0.005 and 0.001. I believe that there are a few obvious limitations to my study that require addressing and could have potentially resulted in me not rejecting the null hypothesis. These limitations include sample size, the subject of the test, and the differences between Dan River and Chatham High School. The sample size of 30 was technically enough to complete the experiment sufficiently, but I feel as if 30 people is not large enough to represent the population I intended. The subject which I used to test the participants, which was World War I history, could have also changed the results in some way. While I used it as it was easy to employ for a memory test and also eliminated most issues with prior knowledge, history is also a limited subject where science, math, or English could have given different results. Finally, a limitation between other groups was the fact that the control group came from Chatham High School while the others were from Dan River High School. I do not believe this drastically affected anything between the visual and auditory groups, but if I had used a different control group, then it perhaps would have changed results. The research I've conducted carries implications for research that could be performed in the future. It is incredibly important to know more about learning styles, as they could influence the academic performance of students. However, my study revealed that the auditory and visual learning styles provided no significant differences between them, which the literature I studied did not agree with. Because of this, future studies should test with different factors that influence the participants, such as age, gender, and other variables. I believe, in the future, more studies could explore increased amounts of learning styles and make corrections to the limitations seen in this study. Furthermore, this study should be an influence to teachers to attempt different learning styles and experiment with what their students achieve more with. I learned a substantial amount from the research process. For example, doing this procedure allowed me to gather greater insight into the field of research. It requires a lot of time and effort to make a research project come together, and I believe the skills gathered from working on this one will let me employ those same skills for more college-level work. A major skill I learned is perseverance, which has taught me to handle long-term work which requires dedication to complete. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Additionally, I'd like to give thanks to Ms. Long, Ms. Fain, and Ms. Gravitt, who all reviewed and guided me through the stages of my research. Because I worked at Dan River and Chatham High School, Dr. Jones, Ms. Brumel, and Mr. Reese also deserve my thanks for granting me permission to use the schools for research. Thank you to Ms. Crabb and Mr. Maxfield for allowing me to use their rooms for testing as well. Of course, thank you to all of my 30 participants who, without them, the procedure would have not been possible. Do you all have any questions? Ms. Waltz?
So could you explain again how you conducted your experiment, because I am not certain I understand how you differentiated between the visual and the auditory.
So Ms. Waltz asked how I differentiated the steps in my research between the auditory and visual groups. So the way I differentiated from the visual groups was they were given a set of notes that they were instructed to read before given a test. I pulled those notes away once the test began so they couldn't use them during. And the auditory group listened to an audio track, which I gave the test after the track ended, and then they took the test.
Collin, do you think, so apparently you gave them the notes, or you had it read to them, and then immediately after that they took the test. Is that correct? Do you think if you would have waited an hour, so you give the notes, they study the notes, you take the notes away, they listen, you take the audio away, an hour later you test, do you think that would change the results?
So Dr. Jones asked if I had given the students more time to study and reflect on the notes and audio track that I gave them, then perhaps the results would have ended up different. And I completely agree. I think this is something that I thought about when doing the test. I thought about the long-term effects and the short-term effects, but the short-term was more convenient, I suppose, to do for this test, so that's why I did that. But it's certainly good to think about maybe assigning these notes and waiting like a week and letting them study and then giving them the test to see if anything changes. So, Mr. Hare. Sorry.
So typically with research, when you are interacting with participants, you share your findings with those individuals. And I didn't see where you mentioned that you were able to provide your conclusions and your information back to your participants for accuracy. Did you do that?
So Mr. Hare asked if I gave the conclusions of my study back to my participants. I did to the ones who asked about it. So I didn't give it back to all of them because, to be frank, most of them didn't really care. So, but the ones that did, I certainly shared the conclusion that I got and what happened. So, Mr. Shaw.
For the visual group, were there graphics provided with their notes, or was it just words?
Mr. Shaw asked if there were any imagery provided in the notes that I gave alongside, or if it was just text. So I only use text, but it is good to think about using imagery, maybe for a future experiment, because imagery could certainly affect memory and perhaps help them with the test. So, I'm sorry, I can't see your name tag.
You're fine. Tara, right there. Did any of your research touch any of like the neurological basis of the memory?
So you asked if my research touched the neurological basis of memory, and no, I didn't look into the neurological aspect of things, but certainly some of the research that I looked at for my review did. So, but that's also something that could be done for future research to look at.